many different avenues of thought came to my mind. For example, that there of course is this human games, the social games and the human peer pressure, which kind of evokes egoism and the need to protect yourself from and kind of maintain your status in the hierarchy of things. And then, of course, there is this spiritual, very personal side to that. The latter brings to my mind the concept of the numinos, which has been throughoutly explored in the previous episodes. But let me just tie this into the concept of the mysterium tremendum, the terrifying side of the numinos. And I think this is just something you have to experience to understand, in the sense that if you would encounter this powerful, disturbing, and destabilizing side of the numinos, then you must also understand that it is not personal, it is not human at all. Maybe it doesn't even have any regard for human or anything. It's like the Deus absconditus. It's completely unknowable. It's a complete mystery. And I think that gives one some kind of perspective, in the sense that when you experience humility via this kind of thing, it's a different that you would be humiliated by some another humans, because I don't think it's a good experience to be humiliated by in a like a vile way by some fucking idiots in like a competitive setting. And I think one must divorce these two things, the spiritual humility and the human games altogether. You know?
Oh no, of course. I mean, I mean, humiliation hurts both the perpetrator and the victim in different ways, but it does. I would say it does equal damage to the soul, at least, of both people. To touch on this, on the idea of the kind of the fear aspect, I think this is certainly something I've been thinking about recently. It's very okay. How can I frame this? There has to be an element of fear if one has an encounter with something unknowable or beyond human. I mean, you know, to take a very simplistic example, I mean, if you look at like the Bible, then I mean, the amount of time, I mean, every time something appears to someone, the first thing it tends to say is, "Be not afraid." Why? Because people are shitting themselves, and quite rightly. I mean, if something appears to you, you know, I mean, your first instinctual reaction is probably not going to be, "Oh, it's a love," you know, it's all love, man. It's going to be good God, what is this? What have I done? You know, it's an instinctual thing, and it's not inappropriate either. I think that, okay, to devolve slightly into a very, very brief avenue here. One of the problems, I think, with, for example, okay, and this is going to, I don't know if anyone outside of the British experience is going to understand this, but the Church of England, okay, the Church of England,
yes, set
up by Henry VIII, effectively to allow him to divorce his wife, and then it became, you know, we separated from the Pope, and we had the Church of England, and that was that. Okay. Recently, obviously around the world, around the West, at least, congregational figures have been dropping off steadily in the past few decades for a multitude of reasons, including the secularization of various societies, etc. Whatever. Okay. But what I find interesting is that, for example, the Church of England, in an effort to appeal to and attract new, especially young people into the church, they have adopted a very kind of right on, pro whatever, LGBTQ, trans, etc. And I'm not talking about that in particular because, firstly, it's just not worth talking about because it's such a complex subject. But what I'm trying to say is they've kind of repositioned the Church of England into such a sort of, hey, love is love and everyone loves, and hey man, God is just a lovely, loving love. There's very little mention of fear, of submission, of authority, all these things which are which one could traditionally link to, for example, the Christian worldview, but also to encounters in general with non-human or extra human, or however you want to describe it, non-extra natural, supernatural, whatever. Fear, the feeling of unworthiness before something, all this sort of thing. That is very natural and normal, and it's actually something which appeals to people because it is a natural reaction to these things. So by jettisoning these elements which are seen as like oppressive, or like might make people think there's something negative in doing something which is wrong, or whatever, it's actually had the adverse effect of turning a lot of, well, firstly, not attracting people, but also turning a lot of the existing parishioners away. So what I'm trying to say is it is impossible. People know it's impossible on an innate sense to divorce sensations of fear, of trembling, of horror, in a sense, when confronted with something which is so unknowable and vast and powerful, to use a rather trite word, that when they are given the opportunity to have something which is like a carte blanche, like, come on in, guys, let's play some guitar and tell everyone how much we love each other, they don't want it because it doesn't feel right on a deep instinctual level. And I think that is something which one can apply to all sorts of areas of religious aspects, regardless of classification, including, people talking about the numinous and of, this idea of like, oh, it's just me chilling out with the genius Loki. No, I mean, you should be worried. You should be treading very carefully if you are a genuine believer in that, for example, because it should have an element of terror in it. It's like a metaphor which you yourself coined many moons ago. It's like if aliens come down, you're not going to be like, oh, hi, well, let me show you around. You're going to be like, fucking hell, I can't even process this mentally.
Yes.
Because it's so outside my intellectual experience.
Yes, definitely. Actually, let me correct you. It was your idea of this encounter with the aliens, in the sense that they're like a real, very actual, not in a movie kind of cinematic way or in
I
story
always
way.
thought it was you.
Yeah, no, it was actually you.
Oh.
And I have used used your metaphor with other guests as well. But you are the originator of this concept, which was, I think it was great in the sense that, yeah, you'll have it. Let me coin one thing which I think is mine own creation. I have called it jokingly four-dimensional reality, in the sense that there is this concept of some kind of like a virtual reality abbreviation, some kind of like a safe space concept people held and dear into their heads when compared to the actual thing. For example, you're watching a horror movie, okay? That's exhilarating and fun, maybe, depending on the movie, of course. If you watch some kind of new, like French horror movies, I don't think they're that entertaining at all. And
there's
they
more
can
incest in those, yeah.
Yeah, and I think they can deliver like a good gut punch in the sense. But then when you compare watching even some kind of very harsh horror movies, when you compare it to the real life, say, for example, if you are watching some fucking Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then there would be in the real, very real life, somebody would be hunting you with a fucking chainsaw. That would be a completely different thing. And I think we are so accustomed in the Western modern world that everything is so catered safe, and it has this like a cousins on. And I think it's the same goes to the with the liminal and the dominoes. For example, in the sense that one like a minor example, I spent the last night sleeping at the old side of our cottage. And I see no perceived and logical threats when I'm sleeping in the cottage. But then again, your subconscious does sense any kinds of scenarios, so to speak. My sleep turned restless. It was like I was more cognizant of the cracks and noises, like in the old cottage. And I even had some like a weird hypnagogic sleep paralysis type nightmares. That's something which can happen in the realm of the sleep, which doesn't give a flying fuck about any logical and consensus reality enforcement in the sense that. And I also had something weird, like a liminal sense of the omnipresent presence, or like a ubiquitous sense of presence when you're like sleeping alone in somewhere which is not as protected as the apartment building bedroom, if you understand what I'm trying to say here. And I think this is like a minor example of how much of a difference it would be to experience the numinals in some kind of like liminal setting than when you are like studying the subject in some kind of, how would you say, like a philosophical way in the confines and the safety of your city apartment through your computer screen. That's a completely two different universes. And I think modern people are losing this bit by bit because they don't experience any kind of like existential danger, at least perhaps in the most civilized countries at the moment. But then again, there are people in Ukraine, there is a war, and that's a completely different hellscape if you compare it to the peacetime, abundance of some modern Western country.
Yeah, there's a great deal of difference between the kind of intellectual and the experiential. And although I say a lot of people experience a kind of existential dread, but they don't really know why. But it's interesting you brought up the war in Ukraine, and one could also say the same thing about the war in Palestine and Gaza, yes, and wars in general. Now, is that they do act, I think, for. It's also the fault of the 24-hour news cycle as well, but they certainly act as a kind of voyeuristic, almost gratification, for people to tune into and watch and see some real shit, I wouldn't say that people crave that, as in terms of war, but it's one of the few examples of viscerality which are kind of readily available to people now, outside of like drugs or all those kinds of things. But yeah, well, the viscerality of voyeurism in terms of war, the viscerality. Well, I don't know. I was going to say the viscerality of hedonism, but the hedonism now is pretty tedious because hedonism now is presented as this sort of like, hey man, live your life. Don't let anyone tell you what to do. Yeah. But that is presented to you within an extremely strict set of parameters. Saturday night from 9 till 3, and then back to work you go. Recover Sunday, and then back to work you go on Monday. Thank you very much. That's enough of that. You can have your next outburst in 6 days' time. I don't know. I think, but I just think you're very right in the kind of the experiential horizon for people now, by their own volition, but also through the nature of the way that everything is structured, is extremely slim.
Yes, it's just incredible, the contrast. If you think about, at least I thought about this some weeks ago, that there might be limits to pleasure, but are there limits to pain? In the sense that I myself haven't obviously experienced the worst kind of pains imaginable, but I understand that there are some kind of levels of pain that I can't even fucking comprehend, and that should kind of bring about some kind of humility to persons that whatever you have experienced before, the worst things in your life, they might be nothing to compare, but might yet to come. Like in the Ulver, the Norwegian band, they had this song called EOS. The lyrics went like this.
The sun is far away. It goes in circles. Someone dies. Someone lives in pain. It's burning into the thin air of the nature of a culture. On the dark side, under the moon, the wolves gather.
I think this kind of poetic lyrics put it so much better than I ever could. The line, someone lives in pain. And currently, it's quite evident that there are some people dying in this moment. Of course, some people are being born in this moment as well. But I think with this rampant hedonism, people just forget about the pain and the suffering, which is also rampant in the world, that they might themselves be enduring the pain and suffering sometimes in the future.
Well, I think there's, pain. Of course, pain often is referred to in an expressly physical sense, and there's a lot of people living with a great deal of pain physically through accident, through disability, through chronic illness, terminal illness as well. I think we shouldn't discount as well that I think there are vast amounts of people living in a kind of chronic metaphysical pain, in which due to a number of factors, economic, social, etc. But to use a very cliche, and not that I can offer an alternative, but like to use a very cliche thing of, you from the age of 18 to 65, you spend the majority of your waking hours performing a task which you don't enjoy, and then your life is gone, effectively. And every day every week, every month is something of a struggle to make ends meet, and you don't have the means to enjoy yourself. You don't have the time to take a break for yourself, or to have any experience in life outside of this hyper confined mechanism, because you need to make ends meet. And I'm not casting myself as some kind of anti-capitalist teenage philosopher, but I think that I really think that having that, and having a burden of no time, really no time. You get up, you at work, you come home, eat, go to sleep. Same thing every day. Maybe 5, 6, maybe 7 days a week, depending on the economic situation. that instills, I would say, a low, well, maybe not low is the wrong word, but a kind of a persistent, not acute, but persistent, chronic, metaphysical pain. Because your capacity for experience is almost entirely eradicated. And without having time, without having the ability, also don't forget through things like education, etc., but to look inside yourself and see a kind of inner realm, which is how to put it, like autonomous to you, and which you you may not have control of many things in your life, but you have that. Without even that, I think that there are vast swathes of the population which are in that predicament. And I don't know. I don't really know what I'm trying to say with that, but I think that there is a huge amount of pain in different formats, but perpetually around us at the moment, especially. The hedonism is kind of like a, how do you describe it?
Like a band-aid to the pain.
Exactly. It's a very flimsy band-aid, which is then ripped off the next day. Because you can't do that. You can't do that seven nights a week. Otherwise you'll die soon. But it's a very, very little temporary cover-up for an artery that's spilling out everywhere.
Yes, that's a very good point about the multitude of that kind of like metaphysical pain, and also what a waste of human potential, in the sense that most of us work as kind of like a modern wage slaves. And I think that's like a huge problem, in the sense that that kind of life is not very fruitful. People are not like manifesting themselves, and they are not like they have no opportunity, if they are like kind of entrapped in the chronos time. They have no opportunity to go inward and really see who they are, like behind the masks. And I think that's infinitely sad. And I think the whole concept, or the idea that somebody is constantly in the string of that said chronos, like the everyday time, I think that's spiritually very, very damaging to the soul. I think that's quite clear.
Hugely. And I wanted to briefly mention something else, which isn't, it's not like directly related, but I think it kind of is. So bear with me. And without, the problem is now that, of course, every time I mention a church, someone's gonna be like, "Oh God, here he goes again." Just because he's fucking moved, just because he's thought he might become a big Christian, now he's always talking about churches. Bear in mind that my doctorate in 2013 was in pilgrimage in medieval Britain, so I've had interest in churches for a long time.
Yeah.
But when I was doing that, actually, there was another PhD student who I knew, who was doing a thesis on Anglo-Saxon churches. And he made a very interesting point, and I think it's a very solid suggestion. And I'm sure that he backed it up with a lot of references, so it's not just like him brain farting. But so in the Anglo-Saxon world, obviously, a great deal of, almost exclusively, timber was used, at least in the early stages, for construction. There was really very little use of stone in construction. apart from the construction of churches. And his suggestion, which I'm pretty sure follows upon a lineage of scholarship, was the difference was that in constructing a church out of stone, it emphasized the atemporal nature of the space within. Timber rots quickly, timber, it can stand for a long time, but it's certainly, when one compares it to stone, it's an infinitely more temporal building material. So the idea was that by using stone for churches, it was expressing the nature of within that space is a time outside of time. Now, with the I'm sure that could be therefore extended to, almost every institutionalized religion or religion which has buildings as part of its infrastructure. This idea of a space within it which is not part of the normal flow of time. It has an element of eternity in it.
Yes.
And one could also extend that, of course, to non-structural proper elements. Things like I don't know what to call, like stone circles, or all monuments, effectively sacred monuments. And by divorcing oneself from experiencing sacred monuments, be they churches, mosques, stone circles, temples, whatever, in at least a sight way in your daily life, even if you're not a kind of someone who goes into them, but especially, of course, someone who goes into them, you are denying yourself the potential to step outside of the hurly-burly time flow of human society and human existence. You are denying yourself the opportunity to taste the stillness and the kind of, depending on where you are, the cyclic or at least the atemporal nature of time in those spaces. And I think by doing that, it induces, which is the case in many secular societies and that kind of thing now, or a-spiritual societies, should we call them. And I think that is something which is a heavy contributor to this nihilistic attitude and this kind of headlong rush towards the band-aid of hedonism and that kind of thing we see now, because you don't get a fucking break.
Yes. It's incessant.
And of course, you can tie that in as well to the idea of the opportunity for a contemplative attitude for a very small space of time, be that prayer, meditation, whatever, but that is also removed from your life, that participatory aspect.
I think that's an excellent idea, or rather like an excellent way to put it. And it comes to my mind, another concept or like a metaphor or whatever it is. It's basically, if you think about light pollution, along with the noise pollution in the city, of course. But the light pollution has this nefarious effect in the sense that it's very hard to see the stars if you're living in some kind of like a major city, and normal people don't have any idea how, for example, in Finland, and I didn't myself too, some 20 years ago, I didn't have the idea that how bright and manifold the stars are when you are in the Lappland, in the middle of nowhere in the winter, without any clouds and the light pollution. And I remember I was in this reindeer selection thing in Lappland. I was participating that as guest, and I wandered off like some 200 meters off the main reindeer selection site, And I completely understood that if I would just wander off like some another 200 meters, I would probably get lost, and it was probably 20 or 30 minus Celsius, so it was very freezing weather, and I just looked upwards and I saw the stars, and I didn't saw the galaxies, but I think you can see Milky Way in Hawaii, I think, because there is so little light pollution over there. So basically, it was like almost psychedelic vision in the sense that haven't had experienced something like that ever in the city, and it really acted as like a good contrast in the sense that I was in a liminal space, in the sense that I would easily off myself just by wandering couple of 100 meters, because nobody can endure in that kind of frozen weather for long. And I didn't, of course, have a good clue wherever we was in I think it's called tundra. And basically, I think the problem that people don't see the stars, they lose the sense that we are actually living in a planet floating in an infinite space, and that's quite a cliche way to put it, but still it rings so true that people don't have these opportunities to divorce themselves in the daily grind, so to speak. And I think you're very right about the problem that people need all kinds of like escapist methods, because it's fucking unbearable, the modern everyday wage slavery without some kind of alleviating drugs, whatever they might be, like TV and the actual hard drugs.
It is. If you put it down on paper, it's horrifying.
Yeah, it's fucking horror. So it's like I don't think people, of course, in the history, there have been an era where people are so diverse from tactile reality.
No,
because everything is becoming more and more virtual, in the sense that it wouldn't take a genius to guess that in the next 20 years we will have such an like virtual reality entertainment systems that nobody would have any incentive to venture outside and do any kind of like sports, because you could be a demigod in some kind of like a fictional universe directly tailored to your own fetishes.
They were trying to sell. I'm probably a bit out of date here, but I remember like a couple of years ago they were trying to sell real estate in the metaverse or something.
Yeah, that's completely possible.
And people were doing it. People are like, I can live next to Snoop Dogg. It was like, what the fuck are you talking about? But I mean, I don't know. I don't know what is at the heart of this this kind of conundrum. Now we've seen, I don't want to get into like AI, blah blah blah, blah, all these different strands which could be gone into. I think this is no point. But there's something. We are. I think now we are much less whole as as a species, effectively. Let me rephrase that. At least in the Western world, okay, because we do live in a very kind of luxurious example, but in some ways, and maybe in terms of physical goods and that kind of thing, but we are certainly less whole as people now than we were, say, even like 50, 60 years ago. And I think that in that vacuum, there's obviously a lot of people rushing to fill it with either. Well, yeah, it's either to fill it with things that they can sell and that kind of thing. And I was watching an interview with Derek Jensen, who I have to say I think is an extraordinary thinker. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with him, but he's an ecologist He was like one of the founders of the whole kind of deep green thing, and I don't agree with absolutely everything he says, but I mean the guy is a very profound person and incredibly genuine. And he used a phrase which he said he got it from somewhere else, but I can't remember where he got it. He says, "You can't plug a void with a void."
Oh.
And I think this is really what is happening, distinctly happening, on a kind of international scale, is that we are being offered a number of voids to plug this aching void within us. But the irony is that that which we can plug that void with is really freely available to us if you want to look at it frankly. But it's far easier to buy the void that's being sold to you to make yourself attempt to feel better.
I think this all is related to something which the Canadian professor John Verweek has a series on in the YouTube. I think it's a 50 episode long, and it's called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I believe I have brought this up even before, but I think we have like a collective meaning crisis. That is the main problem. So what would you say, like after all these thoughts, that is the best way to awake from this meaning crisis? What do you think are the best practices that perhaps you are embarking on yourself?
God, well, I mean,
how do you fight the Kali Yuga, so to speak?
You asked me to diagnose the world's metaphysical ills.
Yes.
Well, look, and the risk of, as we say in English, beating a dead horse. The best answer I can give, and this is not an advertisement, but it's simply an experiential explanation, okay, as to why I have gravitated towards Christianity, for example, okay, after years of studying it in different ways from a purely intellectual facet. And again, this is not an advertisement. I'm not here to proselytize. I'm simply giving my own perspective on why I found something of value within it beyond an intellectual element. And certainly for me, I think so far has very much helped in providing a framework for having more. And bearing in mind, I've dabbled in different things as well. Perhaps the dabbling was the problem. I never really immersed myself. But having said all that, as yet another caveat, what I've found and what has been a tremendous help is the idea or the concept of how would you express this in a way which doesn't sound awesomely cliche? Is the idea of opening oneself up to the potential of it's very difficult actually to phrase it in a way which doesn't sound really lame, like a Baptist or whatever. Opening oneself up to the potential of being effectively judged or having all your flaws and your misdemeanors, all of your problems which spring from you, having those seen and accepting those with the potential to have a greater humility in front of the world, and to have the possibility of discovering within yourself a fragment which is worthwhile and which can carry you forward. And the idea of being there's a very nice little metaphor, for example, of the divine being at your door and kind of very patiently waiting for you to open it. And when you do, if you do, then things are brought into a much larger framework that your previous experience would never have given you the ability to perceive or begin to perceive. The idea of there being something greater than you, I mean genuinely greater than you, is a very comforting thing. Not because it's going to be patting you on the back and saying, what a good boy you've been, but because the fundament of everything can begin to be grasped, maybe not grasped, but perceived and interwoven with yourself. And then eventually you will find that yourself and that, the barriers become smaller and smaller between them. The distance between those two perceptually polar opposites becomes smaller and smaller. In all real, I would say, worthwhile spiritual pursuits, one of the two underlying factors generally are, and this is going to sound very hippie-ish, but that's not my fault. That's the fault of the hippies for misabusing terms. The idea of a kind of unity and love. And I'm not talking about hand-holding and, like, oh my God, isn't it so nice that we're all the same? No. It's a love which is beyond those very trite borders. And it's something which is only experiential. It really cannot be rationalized, which is why, again, I say that, you read things like Eckhart, or I can't remember who wrote it, but even earlier than him, there was a book which actually got the person burned. Because I think it's called The Mirror of the Simple Soul. I believe it was written in Paris in maybe the early 12th century, or maybe the mid 12th century. I'm not really sure. Maybe it's the early 13th century. But this is, if you read mystical works from whatever branch or denomination or religion, or, those two things underlie everything. And because those two things of unity, or of union, perhaps would be a better way of putting it, union and love, really do exist beyond fundamental linguistic capabilities. The use of metaphor, for example, we see the only ways to express it. But the experiential element of that is something which can lift you out from the quagmire of mundane human existence, and not towards something in which you place yourself as a king, but into something far more valuable, in which you fall away from yourself and you are really integrated, not just with your own self, but with that which is in and around everything.
Thank you. That was quite almost as a sermon, and in a good way. It reminded me of lectures by Alan Watts.
Oh yeah, he's
who
good.
I admire greatly. I'm like a big proponent of broadening one's horizons, whichever means necessary, in the sense, because there is nothing worse than to be prison of your own ideas. I think it might have been Einstein who said that. But anyhow, many problems in this world are probably caused that limited thinking and kind of childish dualism, in the sense. Yes, I believe that when people experience something which is far greater than themselves in a nominal sense, is very, very sobering, in the sense that it can wake you up from the trance of consensus reality, from this whatever materialistic nightmare we are sinking in it at the moment.
I think just on a very practical scale, just try to have a little bit of time for yourself on a regular basis to be a little bit contemplative about things. I think that will be very valuable, really, for people. It's not easy, with schedules and things like that. But if you can, if you're watching a couple hours of TV or YouTube a night, I mean, just take half an hour out and just sit and think, and just I think that would be a very helpful thing for a lot of people, actually.
Yes, and I also think that it can also be quite disturbing, in the sense, at least in the early stages, of getting to know oneself, And for example, I have been living mostly in the cottage for the three years now, and I have spent a lot of time alone on my head and with my dogs, and it's like it. At some point, you have to kind of get in terms who you are, and you get to know yourself, and it has this disturbing and maybe exciting components too. And I think people are much more wilder and more interesting and imaginative, and maybe even weirder than they care to admit, because they haven't really seen themselves without the mask of consensus reality, the peer pressure and whatnot. And I think that is something I could recommend. But I would also give a warning that if you have no experience of dealing with yourself, like really like getting to know who the hell you really are, and in the beginning stages, I'm quite sure that it will be a disturbing experience to kind of peel off the mask.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I can't. It's like if you were an alcoholic and then you give up drinking.
Yes,
you're gonna have you're going to remember some pretty embarrassing or humiliating experiences. But that's all right, because you need to know what you were doing in order to not do it or to not continue like that. And I think as well, we it's very easy for people who are involved in more spirituous pursuits to look down on those who don't, or those who and we're all guilty of that, I think, in various ways. But a lot of this isn't people's fault, really. If you're never given the time, if you're never given the impetus, and of course, you can say, oh, well, you should be, intellectually curious enough to, but not everybody is. And that's just the way some people are not. And that, that's just the way they were made. And even that is, even me saying that, sounds quite judgmental, which I guess it kind of is. But, there's a terrible misuse of the word kindness now. Be kind. Without actually being kind.
Yeah.
And kindness now is generally speaking, a very performative act to gain you some kind of social credit. But having or making time for a small break of contemplative time, or however you want to call it, sitting, whatever, walking, however you wish to do it, and having an attitude which preserves a fragment of kindness in you. I mean, they all say, in relationships that kindness is the most underrated virtue, and that's very true. In the course of a long life together with someone, you want someone who has kindness in them. And these are things which are now simultaneously broadcast as desirable virtues, but enacted in such a way that they're almost the opposite, because they're vastly self-serving. And also, the idea of kindness, for example, is also spat upon by certain sects of people who are very much in the kind of, gotta grind, get ahead, enlarge myself, alpha, blah, 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 blah. And I'm not getting into the whole toxic masculinity debate, because it's another retarded debate. It's disingenuous and unimportant, I think, really. But these values, which have sustained many spiritual pursuits for hundreds or thousands of years, they do have some value to them. And the idea of having time to know yourself, making time to know yourself, and to look inside a bit, and to try and treat people in a decent way, sounds such an incredibly basic and banal thing, but curiously is not really taken up in the way that it could be. And I think that if people would use a bit of that, they would find their lives to be vastly improved.
Yes, I think global but act global, in the sense that people need to see what's in front of them, the immediate things in their life, and which they can really act upon, instead of having these pipe trips about the world peace and whatever, which is
my God, man. You look at politics. How many people were trumpeting about like end this, end that? But do you ever see them in like a soup kitchen
Yes.
Or,
It's much easier to.
or feeding stray cats. No, because it's much easier to perform on a big scale than to really be on a small scale.
Yeah, I think it was Ernst Jünger who was paraphrasing some kind of East European parable which said something like, when people try to act as angels, they turn into devils.
Very astute comment. Yeah.
Yeah. This is a good way to actually to end this interview, that as a reminder that people really need to do some Jungian shadow work, in the sense that instead of too easy to judge upon other people as well. And I think if people get to know the capability for evil in themselves, this world would be a better place, especially those people who are shining the brightest in their so-called invented moral glory.
No, absolutely. And
Because
just as a final little a final drop of contention, like a lot of people chat about Jung. A lot of people, I've heard a lot of people use Jung's vocabulary in a way to justify their own hubris. I mean, the whole Wotan, archetypes, shadow work, integrating my shadow self. The purpose of all that is not for you to become a powerful and aggressive or superhuman person. It's to be a better person, better in a really holistic sense. That's what all of this psychotherapy and all these elements are, is for you to become a better person, not to become a more aggrandizing person. And I absolutely fed the fuck up with all these people who are like, oh man, yeah, I'm just taking these archetypes here and I'm really plunging into the archetypes and fucking, that kind of thing. And it's like, you're really not getting it, I think, because what you're doing is taking these very potent aspects and trying to funnel them in to a mechanism by which you can feel more powerful. It ain't about that. It really ain't. It's about being a more holistically better, good, dare I say, person in terms of being rounded and healed within and projecting that out once you've done all that, which can take years, man. It's not about you reading a quote online and then be like, oh man, yeah, bro, Wotan's in my soul. Calm down. Just really, stop it. But that's just my little bugbear on that.
It seems we are two middle-aged angry cheesers. But then again, these have a merit, this kind of harsher points, in the sense that I think any kind of depth is actually disturbing when you really get too deep. It's when you get out of your depth, so to speak, into the unknown territory where you are not in control. And I could maybe close this with my own suprarational, even mystical experience, but this has nothing to do with hippies, because this was probably metaphysically one of the most disturbing experiences I have ever had of this ilk. It went something like this. I was in some kind of rural setting, and in real life, this of course happened in my head, but yet again, still, I saw bars, like in a prison. You have these prison bars in front of a window which prevent you from escaping. And there were real actual bars, but it was not a prison setting. I put my hands on the bars and I really imagined how it would feel like to be in real life imprisoned for life in some kind of like a hideous prison, And I felt the solitude and I felt the torment of time, in the sense that I thought that I would never be released. And then I heard the prison guard approaching, and he had this button on, and it was night, and he was like a kind of slapping the wall and the
Oh my
bars
God.
in order to make noise and to wake up the prisoners, because what the hell, the prisoners in his mind were just vermin or whatever. It was like it was right thing to do, because he was the arbitrator of suffering and judgment to those prisoners. And in my experience, I had turned from the prisoner to the prison guard, and I suddenly experienced the feeling of power and the feeling of justification, that I'm so much higher than the prisoners, and then I was the prisoner after that, and it turned into this weird kaleidoscope of I couldn't in that kind of abraxas type radical fusion. I wouldn't divorce myself from being the prisoner and the prison guard at the same time. I kind of understood the perspectives of the two opposites, if you don't know what I mean.
Yeah,
And it was really disturbing. It was really like harrowing, nothing ever before. And then it went worse. It was like a slippery slope to some kind of live nightmare, if you catch my drift.
Yeah.
And it really brought me to my knees. And after that, I felt it has been very, very hard to judge people, because I feel like I was shown the two sides of the coin, and there was no carpet to kind of bury your own mistakes, if you catch my
Yes.
drift.
Okay. Yes.
Yes.
Well, I mean that. Yeah. Aside from you having some very curious dreams, it's it then boils down to the concept of humility, doesn't it? Really, this idea of learning in a very visceral sense, humility, and something which I feel we all must learn in order to be more awake, really, and more alive to things. And you said, I mean, you yourself just said that having trouble judging people in the same way you did before, after those dreams. You are more alive to things now through the
Yes.
through the lesson of humility through that dream. So a valuable lesson, which everyone should learn, I think, really.
Yes, I really think that some people would. It would be a gift for them to experience something like this. Of course, that was by no means pleasant experience. I think it was
No.
in like a short term. I think it took me a couple of weeks to wholly process, and I felt I had been beaten up in some kind of dark metaphysical alley. But afterwards, I really understood the importance that it was basically this kind of, like I said, like an abraxas type of fusion of the opposites.
I can imagine.
I think this is a good epitome for this podcast, and thank you again, Martin, for this
That's absolutely
enlightening
my pleasure.
and even harrowing conversation and sharing your profound insights.
I imagine there'll be parts of it which people feel are less interesting, shall we say, because some of the things are well-worn tropes. But sometimes well-worn tropes have value, demonstrated by their longevity. So hopefully people can bear that in mind.
Yes.
But yeah, it's been lovely. Another fruitful conversation, I would say.
Stay tuned for Martin's track, From Hilltop Priory to the Gleaming Vale. Good night.
My travelling companion asked for the proprietor, and immediately a little gay and lively man came forward and said, "Here is the prior. What do you want with him?" "To see the valley and his priory." "Welcome," said he. "Welcome whoever wishes to see the valley and the priory." He then opened a door which admitted us from the courtyard to a terrace. "You come at a favourable moment," said he. "Look and be silent." I looked indeed, and for a long time never opened my lips. The terrace on which we stood was exactly in the situation to see the picture in the true perspective, and also in the most favourable light. For the rising sun gave an extraordinary relief to every object. The mist, which had just before been over my head, was now under my feet. It spread out like an immense sea, and rolled against the mountains and into their smallest sinuosities. I saw groups of trees, the trunks of which were immersed in the vapour, while their heads hardly appeared above it. Castles with 4 towers, of which only the slated roofs were visible. The slightest breeze which rose agitated this mass like an ocean. Near me it struck against the sides of the terrace, and I could have stooped to draw from it as from a well. The sun's rays soon after penetrated, agitated, and produced a kind of whirlwind. Suddenly it rose in the air, appearing like a shower of gold. Nothing could be seen through this fiery vapour, and even the disk of the sun was entirely concealed. This sight resembled the illusion of a dream, but a moment after, the vapour again descended. The air was as pure, and the fog as thick, though not so high as before. Thanks to this sinking of the fog, more trees showed their heads, and hills till then unperceived presented their grey and verdant summits.